All right. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Sorry for keeping you waiting. We had some technical issues. We're going to get started right away. Just some quick housekeepings. Probably old hat by now, but please mute your microphone during the presentation so there's no background noise that gets picked up. We will have time for questions at the end. You can also drop questions that you think of in the chat, and we might be able to get to those during the presentation as well. And we'll also try our best to ask them all at the end also. So why we're here is that underfunding of public schools in Pennsylvania is widespread. As you'll see in the presentation, there are hundreds of school districts that are thousands of dollars per student away from what they would need to provide what the state says is an adequate education. But it's also very concentrated. We have some of the most unequal schools in terms of resources between low wealth communities and communities with more wealth, and students of color are concentrated in the most underfunded schools. So in this presentation, we'll talk about how we got to this unacceptable status quo, and we'll talk about a lawsuit that Dan and Christina are attorneys leading to change it, taking on the state legislature in Harrisburg. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dan Ureva-Gackelsberg from the Public Interest Law Center, who will get us started.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to start by give you a bit about how this presentation will work. I'm going to talk for the first 20 minutes or so and to describe the problem. And then my colleague from the Education Law Center, Christina Moon, will talk about sort of our solution. So Christina, do you want to just start by introducing you and the Education Law Center?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Education Law Center is a nonprofit legal services organization. We serve students in public schools across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have big impact litigation and policy advocacy related to school funding, as well as individual representation and impact litigation on behalf of students and parent issues that come up in terms of discipline, school climate, as well as ensuring access for students with disabilities, English learners, and students who are involved in foster care and juvenile justice systems, for example.
And I'm a staff attorney at the Public Interest Law Center. We are a high impact civil rights litigation nonprofit. We use those legal strategies to advance the civil, social, and economic rights of communities in our region. And so I want to start with a little bit of table setting. So this is an article that the headline will not seem surprising to anyone, given what we've all gone through, which is, coronavirus closes schools, wealthier districts, send laptops home with students. What about poor districts, right? So we've all experienced the last year amid this sort of societal turmoil, the disparate ways that that certain communities experience that. But what I think is most remarkable about this article is the date. Right. So March 18th, 2020. Schools closed from COVID on March 16th, 2020. Right. And the fissures and the fault lines in our society and how we treat low wealth kids, low wealth communities are so obvious. Schools close on Monday, and by Wednesday on the front of the Inquirer, there's a knowing story that low wealth communities are going to get the short end of this stick. Right. We live with this. It is so obvious that it is almost instant that we know what's going to happen. One other thing, I want to go through a couple of quotes. All right. So Pennsylvania has significant financial inequities in its system of school funding, with one of the largest gaps of any state in the country in per child spending between the Commonwealth's poorest and wealthiest districts. Is that my organization saying that? Is that Christina's organization saying that? So that's the money going in, right? Significant financial inequities. And little surprise, as a result, we have some of the most significant achievement gaps between low-income students and students of color and their white, more affluent peers. Similar gaps are evident with respect to high school graduation rates and on, right? So both the money going in and the results you get. We have these huge gaps. Who says that? Who's authored that report where this quotes come from? It's not the Public Interest Law Center. It's not the Education Law Center. It's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania itself, right? As recently as August of 2019. And so as we go through what's wrong with the school funding system and what we're doing to change it, one of the things that's really important to know is we're not giving you any secret statistics. This is all pulled from public data about why, this is all, you could go on to the Department of Education's website and get all of this yourself if you knew where to look, right? These fault lines are in plain view. When we think about the long-term problem overall with Pennsylvania school funding, there's really some themes you're going to hear a lot. The first is that there is no goal in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania of fully funding public schools. Doesn't exist on the state level. It's not as if each year the legislature gets together and says, what do our schools need this year? How much money do they need? Or what resources do they need? How many teachers do they need to achieve a certain goal? That conversation doesn't happen. It does happen at the local level if you're a middle class or upper middle class school district, right? Where the superintendent can go to the school board and say, here's what I think we need this year. The school board approves it. But if you're a low wealth school district, the conversation that a superintendent has with its board is, here's what here's what we can afford to do this year, or here's what we have to cut this year, right? And all of that stems from a failure at the top, at the state legislature, to actually have a goal of giving schools what they need. The second is that the Commonwealth makes a relatively low contribution to education. Most of the money spent on education, I'll show you this, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania comes from local government. And as a result, in a heavily economically segregated state, what a school has is largely dependent on how wealthy it is. The third is that most of our funding is not based on any rational formula. And the fourth is that when you put it all together, low wealth communities need the most, try the hardest, and have the least. So I'll show you a bit of that as we go. If you put every state on a graph and you said, okay, of all the dollars spent in that state, how much come from state government itself? Most states, it's a combination of state and local government with a small amount of federal funding. But how much of the funding within that state comes from the state government itself? Pennsylvania always ranks near the bottom, right? Anywhere from 36 to 37% of education dollars in the Commonwealth are actually coming from the state itself. And here's how that plays out. Here's the problem with that. So what you're looking at is every school district in Delaware County, okay? And I know the type is small here, but what you're looking at is for each school district, their effective property tax rate. It's not their actual property tax rate, which is a combination of, which is dependent on how many mills, whether a county assesses property 100% of the value, et cetera, et cetera. But it's what the state thinks the effective property tax rate is for each one of these school districts, okay? And that's that middle column, the tax burden equalized mills. And what that means is you just take that number and you divide by 10. And that's what the state thinks is the effective property tax rate in that school district, right? So in the middle or so, you see, for example, Radnor taxes at 14.8 equalized mills. The state thinks Radnor taxes at 1.48% of the actual value of their property each year. Right? But within Delaware County, what you see is a huge variation in property tax rates, right? So Radnor in the middle, 1.5% of the value of their property. William Penn School District all the way at the bottom, 34.6 equalized mills, right? 2.5 times what Radnor taxes its property at. And that's not particularly fair, right? William Penn has to tax its property at far higher rates. And if you know those districts, you know that William Penn doesn't have the wealth that a place like Radnor does. But the real problem is the next column over, right? Which is how much money is actually generated from that tax rate, right? So you go back to Radnor in the middle. Radnor generates $22,000 just locally per child from its tax rate. You go back to William Penn, taxing at a far higher rate, they generate $8,800 per kid. And that's really the story of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. These low wealth communities actually tax at higher rates, but they can't come up with the funds because they are low wealth. So here's a couple of extreme examples of how that plays out. One of our wealthiest school districts in the Commonwealth, New Hope in Bucks County, and one of our poorest, Reading. So New Hope taxes at a rate of 12 equalized mills. They generate from that $25,500 per child. The state kicks in $4,600 to New Hope. And so state and local resources combined, New Hope has $30,000 per kid. The Reading School District taxes at a rate of over twice that. But they don't generate $25,000 per kid. They generate $2,500 per kid. And now the state does kick in more to Reading than it does to New Hope, but it's not nearly enough to close the gaps between one of our wealthiest and one of our poorest districts. And I'm giving you extreme examples on purpose. But who needs more, Reading or New Hope? Well, in New Hope, 9.7% of kids are in poverty. One of the easiest ways to look at the needs of a student body is to look at the percentage of kids that are in poverty. In Reading, it's not 9.7%, it's 94%. Another resource needy group of kids are kids that are learning English. They need smaller class sizes, right? In New Hope, 2.8% of kids are learning English. In Reading, 26% of kids are learning English. So in Pennsylvania, the districts that need the most get the least. And so how did we get here? Well, in 1991, our school funding entered sort of this ice age, where everything was frozen in time. How a state viewed a district stopped being updated. So up to 1991, we had a formula that actually looked at the characteristics of a school district, whether a school district was growing. And then in 1991, it stopped. And what the state gave you each year was just largely based on what you looked like in 1991. We're going to talk about hold harmless, and this is really the origin of the hold harmless problem, which is that the state was no longer accounting for school districts growing or getting poorer or getting wealthier. And if we think about what that actually means, this is like my Rorschach test, depending on the age of an audience, right? Who are these people? Well, in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev was just finishing his final few months as the head of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was finishing its final few months as an actual entity. George H.W. Bush was president. LeBron James was 8 years old, and Barack Obama was the president of Harvard Law Review. A lot has changed in this world since 1991. But in Pennsylvania, over and over and over, what you got was largely based on what you looked like in 1991. And so there have been some changes in the last 6 years. It's fair to say that Tom Wolf is a friend of public education. And he came into office with really bold proposals, right? And he proposed that in his first 4 years in office, he was going to give $2 billion to education, including to the districts that had been cut the hardest by his predecessor. But then he hit the reality of Harrisburg. And in year one, there was this huge budget standoff. And so instead of $500 million in year one and $2 billion overall, we had this 2-year budget where total, he got about $350 million. And then since then, it's been more of the same. In fact, in his first 6 years in office, we have increased basic education funding in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania by $700 million. And that may seem like a lot, but we spend money on education. It's an expensive thing to do. And in fact, that's less than inflation, right? So since Tom Wolf has come into office, we have increased funding less than the rate of inflation. We are still living with the Tom Corbett budget cuts, in effect. One thing that's good that's happened is that we have enacted what's colloquially known as the fair funding formula, right? So amidst the not the failures of the last few years, but the struggles of the last few years to actually meaningfully increase school funding, we enacted something that's often called the fair funding formula, which actually, I talked about that 1991 problem. It actually starts to look at what a school district needs a little bit. And so what it does is it takes into account the relative needs of a school district. It looks at the students in poverty in a school district. It looks at the kids learning English and a couple of other things in a school district. It's pretty good in terms of saying like, kids that are in poverty need X more, right? But here's the problem with it. It's a relative distribution formula only. It's only about dividing the pie. It's not about how big the pie should be. In other words, purposely excludes how much total funding is needed, right? That failure that I talked about at the beginning, the failure to have a goal of adequately funding public schools, that is right embedded in the funding formula itself. It's a zero-sum game, right? And I'll explain that in a minute. But it also, and the other thing is that the funding formula, when it was enacted, there was a decision made that the funding formula only applies to money that is spent up and above the levels of when it was enacted. And I said that somewhat confusingly, but think about it this way. In 2015, we spent about $5 billion on basic education funding in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And it was distributed through this crazy method based on what you looked like in 1991. All of that money is still distributed in this crazy way based on what you looked like in 1991. That $5.5 billion goes out in the same exact crazy manner. But that $700 million that Tom Wolf has gotten since he's come into office, that $700 million is distributed through the fair funding formula. So 700 through the funding formula, 5.5 billion through what you looked like in 1991. And our colleague, Susan Spica from Education Voters often talks about this. Practically speaking, the decision to use 1991 demographics and the decision to not have a goal of adequately funding public school for all creates a Hunger Games in Pennsylvania, right? A district, the only way for a district to win is if another district loses, right? You have to win at the expense of another community, right? So you'll hear a lot about hold harmless, and I'll show you these numbers, but there's a premise in the hold harmless fight. And that premise is that we only have a finite amount of funding that we can give. And that if we don't, and there's not a dollar more, and therefore, if Philadelphia gets $1, then Lower Merion gets $1 less, right? Something like that. So this is what I mean. So you hear about hold harmless, and what hold harmless means is that what ending hold harmless would mean is that we're no longer going to use those 1991 demographics. We're gonna speed up and go to 2019, and we're going to say, what does the district look like today? And we're going to divide up the pie for that district this year. There'd be huge amounts of money moving around, over $1 billion. And for some low wealth districts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that's a great thing. So for the city of York, they would get an additional $46 million, $5,000 per kid, just from moving, just from ending hold harmless, from saying, okay, we're going to put all that money through that new formula we use. Instead of $700 million, we're going to put it all through, right? Great news for York and Allentown and Reading, right? They get significant amount of funding. But because it's a zero-sum game, because it's the Hunger Games, York gets it at the expense of another district, right? So York gains $5,700. The Southside Area School District loses almost $8,000 per kid. Now, these districts here might be better off than York or Reading, but some of them may actually not have enough funding, right? They're just relatively better off because we as a Commonwealth don't actually fully fund public schools. Instead, we give out a pie of money and we ask school districts to fight over it. And like, why does this matter, right? What does an underfunded school look like? Well, here's an underfunded, a child who went to an underfunded school in Philadelphia, where there were leaks in the roof or leaks in the pipes that were not repaired, lead paint peeled down from the ceiling, came onto his desk, he ate it, and he was poisoned, right? Why this matters is because it's teachers, it's counselors, it's nurses, it's facilities, it's technology, it's all the things that we all intuitively understand that all children deserve. And why it matters is because you see significant differences in the results. Standardized tests are not the be all and end all, but we have huge problems with our standardized test results, which certainly at least show that something is off. And if you don't like standardized tests, look at how many kids are going to college. One of the things we have found in part of the litigation that Christina is going to talk about is, as expected, college attendance is much lower in lower spending school districts. But it's not just that. If you are a low wealth child in a high spending district, you're in Pennsylvania, you're much more likely not only to go to school, but to graduate from college, right? So you take that low wealth kid and you put him in a well-funded district, that child is way more likely to go to college and graduate from college. So, this is like the short version of all of these huge problems in our school funding system. And, you know, all of this matters, right? The outcomes, the experiences of our children, from what they actually experience in the day-to-day with their teaching staff and the counselors and the technology and all the rest, and also what they walk out of walk out with at 12th grade. And so that's sort of the problem. And I will turn it over to Christina to, you know, we're lawyers, so you can talk about what our legal solution is to it.
Thanks, Dan. Right, so with all of those huge problems in mind, we filed in 2014 a lawsuit in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court. Again, filed in 2014, so we've been at this fight for a very long time. And our case has two claims, really. And they're based on the Pennsylvania Constitution, which says the General Assembly is responsible for ensuring a thorough and efficient system of public education. And the reality facing our students in schools, as Dan explained, is of course that they don't have the resources they need to meet state standards and participate meaningfully in the economy and our democracy. So our case really alleges two different problems. That the funding system is inadequate because the state doesn't provide the school districts with the resources they need to serve their students, and that this funding system is inequitable because the way that the funding we do have is distributed by the state creates these outrageous disparities between school districts that Dan explained earlier. Next slide. So our petitioners on whose behalf we brought this lawsuit includes 4 families and 6 school districts across Pennsylvania and 2 statewide organizations, the NAACP of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. We also highlight the School District of Philadelphia among those listed here through a parent petitioner in that school district, and also members of the NAACP, our party, our petitioner. Next slide. The respondents, we are suing those state actors that are responsible for this school funding system. So that's the leaders of the Pennsylvania Senate and the House of Representatives, the governor, the State Department of Education, the Secretary of Education, and the State Board of Education. Next. What we're asking the court to do is first declare that this current system of funding is unconstitutional. And then to fix it, that the legislature needs to increase the amount of money provided by the state to schools, and they need to ensure that those additional funds are driven to districts serving students who have the most significant needs. So to do that, we have to prove what is that constitutional standard? What does it look like in schools? And have we met it? Have the schools, you know, if the standard, for example, is students being able to meet those academic standards set by proficiency on academic assessments, or if it's graduating college and career ready, like the State Department of Education says, you know, our school is actually able to do it. And Dan says, as Dan mentioned, we have evidence that, in fact, we have abysmal academic scores in our underfunded districts, and also lower graduation rates and inability to go to college and graduate. Also, do we need more money to actually meet those standards, or is it somehow somebody else's fault? And I'll get to that a little bit later. And then on the equal protection side, is there any reason that justifies the inequity between school districts and the amount of money that they receive? So respondents on the other side try to distract with a comparison of Pennsylvania to other states across the country, but on, for example, something like national NEEP scores. But our case is about our state constitution and what it obligates our state leaders to do for our Pennsylvania students. And we know from all the evidence that we will present that our students are not getting what they need to succeed. So they also suggest that the funding formula solves any problems, but as Dan explained, the funding formula is an acknowledgement of funding need, but the state has actually failed to put the majority of funding through that formula. So students are still not getting the amount of funds that they actually need. And then the last two bullets are, some examples of that, placing blame elsewhere, blaming students or parents or outside factors instead of taking responsibility for this constitutional obligation on the state to provide a thorough and efficient system of education for the Commonwealth students. Where we are now, next slide. Through last year, 2020, we went through a discovery period that included hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, over 70 depositions of school district witnesses, legislative witnesses, parents and students, and over 13 expert reports and 11 rebuttal reports have been exchanged between the parties. We have a financial expert breaking down the state funding system. We have experts explaining how money matters and the impact it has on student outcomes and the larger economy, explaining the effective interventions and factors that we know work if we would only fund them. We've also seen summary judgment motions, which are where one party can say there is not enough here to move forward and somebody should be dismissed. We got to minor motions in that way, but nothing that would prevent us from moving the whole case forward. And in fact, we have already received word that we won one of those motions and we have arguments set for the next. So we're hoping to hear in the next month or so, maybe where actually we can expect to schedule the trial, but it should be this year, which has been a long time coming. So what we'll show includes these race and class disparities. So Pennsylvania's school districts are among the most segregated by race and class lines of anywhere in the nation. Living in poverty without resources can have a big impact on development and achievement for kids, but it's also clear in the research, and our experts will address this, that academic outcomes do improve when schools have the resources to provide proven interventions like high quality preschool, smaller class sizes, highly trained teachers, sufficient school counselors to support kids at all levels, not just triaging crises, and social workers and community liaisons to connect families with external resources and services. And that the money invested in these interventions really enables students living in poverty to meaningfully engage in their curriculum and make academic progress. So how much money exactly do districts need to actually meet the needs of their students? State law has set a formula for calculating the resources that schools need so their students have a shot at reaching academic standards. And the law says that the state should calculate this, how much school districts need to reach this target each year, but they haven't done it for years. So our expert did the work and calculated the numbers. We found that according to the state's formula, 277 Pennsylvania districts need more than $2,000 per student, additional money to adequately support their students' learning and graduate them ready to compete in today's economy. And altogether, according to the formula built into the state law, districts statewide need $4.6 billion more invested over time to adequately educate our children. And we've got some examples of the gaps here, but you can check the gaps across all of the school districts in the website funderschoolspa.org. This is actually a conservative estimate, the $4.6 billion. It could likely be higher if we factored in higher academic standards that have been set since 2005 and any additional resources needed to meet the higher standard. Increasing costs for teacher pensions and charter costs, additional weights in the basic education formula that recognize some populations of students need more supports to make progress. The number could be even higher because we are so far behind. And so Governor Wolf, you may have heard, as you're interested in school funding news, this month Governor Wolf proposed a historic investment of additional $1.35 billion in basic education funding, and he suggested that it be directed to underfunded schools with students that need it the most. There's also an additional $200 million in special ed funding, support for pre-K and Head Start. This is the type of big investment that we need to increase both the amount of money in the pie and to ensure that it's distributed more equitably. So we would be thrilled to see this enacted. Unfortunately, Republicans have said this proposal is dead on arrival. And next slide, really, whether it's Governor Wolf's proposal or sending all state funding through the formula, there's no, neither of those is a single fix to the problem, because remember, as Dan described, we have two problems and two claims in our lawsuit. There is both not enough money. We need to set the benchmark for what students need and actually fund that. And we need to equitably distribute it to those districts that most need it, so that we're not relying on the lower wealth communities having to tax themselves at much higher rates to have any hope of raising money without state additional funding. So what we hope to accomplish with our lawsuit, seeing these, sorry, next slide. Seeing no movement from the state actors that's going to solve both of those problems. What our lawsuit can accomplish, and what has been accomplished in similar lawsuits in other states across the country, is with an order from the court that the state has to address this problem and take on their constitutional obligation. Lawsuits like ours have brought in more revenue than the state might have otherwise directed. And that would certainly increase academic achievement and lifetime successes. We hope that with the intervention from the court, that we would be able to break this political impasse over funding with the independent oversight of the court. So that's what we are doing, and what we hope that you can do to support this effort for increased and more equitable funding for public schools. Is to stay informed about this case. Thank you for being here so much. We really appreciate your engagement, and to be considering these steps. So if you share your story at the website fundourschoolspa.org, you can sign up for a newsletter that's going out, I think, monthly now. And there's also a box to include an example of how your how funding has been impacted your family or the students, if you're a teacher or staff in school. Share that story with us that we can consider for public advocacy. There's also chances to write letters to the editor of your local newspaper. Share information like this and opportunities for future webinars on social media. Always share your concerns with your Pennsylvania legislators. And if any of you are involved in other organizations that you think folks would be interested to hear this presentation about the problem and about our proposed solution and how we can work together, please let us know, because we're happy to meet with other folks and share this information. This is contact information for Dan and I if there are individual questions afterward, but I think folks, we still have time on the clock for some questions from the chat.
Yep, I think we're scheduled for another 20 minutes. So if we'll go through the chat and pull them out, and you can put more in. And if there's something you feel is like you can't write down, we're happy to to unmute yourself if that's better. The first question that I see is from Bill Ewing, asking whether the Equal Rights Constitutional Amendment that is scheduled for the ballot this spring has any relevance to this suit. Bill, I might ask you to unmute because and explain which there's a couple of constitutional amendments potentially going forward this spring. One that was projected to and then kind of stopped about gerrymandering the courts, which has hit some roadblocks, which is certainly a problem for anyone who believes, I think, in functional democracy. But I'm not sure which one you're talking about here.
There's one that, did I unmute?
Yep.
Did, yes. There's one that says it guarantees equal rights regardless of race or color or something. It's ridiculous. I mean, I thought it was already in there.
I'd have to go back and look to see what I am not sure I even knew that ballot amendment
Well,
existed. We've been
yeah,
monitoring.
It's the one, Dan, it's the one they tacked on to the stripping the governor of his powers in the emergency.
Okay, right. So
Tacked on.
right. So okay. So right. So there's a
The answer is no.
right. So there's a larger amendment about that's sort of the legislature fighting back over what they perceive as the governor exercising emergency powers during COVID. And to the extent that they have tacked on equal rights amendments to that, I would just say, practically speaking, it makes it more likely that amendment will fail to actually make it to the ballot to begin with, because in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there's very narrow circumstances in which you can amend the Constitution. And one of the rules is that you can't tackle different subjects differently. I mean, sorry, you can't tackle different subjects in a single ballot question. So if it is a single ballot question, it means it's not likely to.
Well, the joint resolution says that this single resolution has following separate and distinct amendments to the Constitution.
Okay.
So presumably, if it's been repassed, and somebody told me it had, it would be a separate amendment, it would appear a separate question on the ballot.
Okay. Well, so
It is on the ballot.
Hmm?
It will be on the ballot.
Okay, good. Somebody knows.
okay. So
Yes,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me, if you had checked, not that everyone can, the Inquirer on last Tuesday on the 18th, the notice was there, and it will be a separate thing on the ballot.
Okay. Well, so practically speaking, again, I have to go back and look at it in detail, but an amendment which says that there's some equal rights obligation of the Pennsylvania Constitution won't really impact our case. Our equal protection case is based on the wealth of communities. And it's also based on the fact that we believe under the Pennsylvania Education Clause, education is an important or fundamental right. So practically speaking, I don't think it would be impacted, but I need to go back and check in some detail, because you taught me something that I didn't know.
Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because of the race or ethnicity of the individual. That's
Okay.
it.
So we have an equal protection provision, and
That's what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, this is like getting pretty inside baseball, but the Pennsylvania Constitution doesn't have an explicit equal protection clause that looks like the federal Constitution. We have different provisions which Pennsylvania Supreme Court has interpreted as saying, well, they're the same. They're the same, even if they don't look quite the same. So it sounds like that's a pretty similar thing. So I don't know that will have any practical impact. I saw a question, and then I'll just go through these, Christina, and if you want to answer. There was a question about, is this a matter of receiving political support? Do you want to talk about why we want the public engaged in this kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So our hoped for outcome, of course, as I mentioned, is the court ordering the legislature and governor, all the state actors to undertake their constitutional obligation and to come up with a fix. But our suit we don't prescribe what that is in detail. So, it's going to come back to the legislature. And that's where I think all of you come in to make sure that we keep pressure on, and they hear from folks that this really matters, that it matters not just for those of us that live in underfunded districts, but folks who live in wealthier communities and still care about all of the kids throughout the state who are going to, of course, be impacted by and impact the broader economy and our democracy. So we do absolutely see a need for continued public pressure on our legislators to be sure that, the remedy that follows after any court order is really going to serve our students.
Yeah, and you know what you see in other states is, you know, there's a lot of this type of litigation around the country, and the ultimate success of the litigation, if you think is more, you know, what your goal is to get more funding to the kids who need it and to have those outcomes increase. You know, a lot of that ultimate success is based on how much political pressure there is. Besides, you know, a really good verdict, a really good ruling, you still need the legislature, I think, to feel some pressure to act, because what they can do is really drag their feet. You know, when you're talking about billions of dollars, it's not like, you know, if this were I had a contract with the legislature for $100,000 and they didn't pay me, and I sued the legislature and they still didn't want to pay me, a judge would just say, I order the treasury, you know, the Treasury Department to write this person a check or to take money out of this account, and here you go. But when you're talking about billions of dollars, it's not really a possibility. You need the legislature to actually take affirmative steps to raise funds. And so if we don't want this to drag out for, you know, 10 years, you know, if knock on wood, we are victorious, then you really need the legislature to feel pressure to act. There's a question about the impact of, or how do charter schools impact the situation in this lawsuit? I'll start that one. I think for the most part, I mean, there's a lot of problems with how we govern, how our governance structure for charter schools, the failure to do any meaningful oversight. We've had a charter appeals board that's been empty effectively for years. That said, I think that charter schools, like a charter school in Philadelphia, is just as underfunded as a general matter as the school district of Philadelphia is, right? Their funding is a direct, is essentially the same. And I think that in terms of how charter schools impact underfunding overall, I think, you know, you can be pro charter school or anti charter school, but I think it's pretty clear from the research at this point that when you have two separate systems, there's added costs to that. And if you don't compensate an authorizing school district for that cost is then borne by the kids still in the school district themselves, right? So if a kid leaves their school district and goes to a charter school, you know, they're authorized that their home district still has to turn the lights on, heat the building, probably pay as many teachers. So there's a lot of costs that are stranded with that district, and that comes out of their bottom line. And we used to, for a short period of time in Pennsylvania, compensate districts for that. And then amid the enormous budget cuts of 2010-11 or 11-12, we took that away. So there is an impact on sort of the resources that districts have to spend on their kids. In terms of the lawsuit, you know, they're underfunded too.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd add is that if you're interested in this, you can check out Education Law Center's website for some reports about the disparities in some of the demographics of students that are served in some charter schools. You know, so one suggested comparison as well, if students in charter schools perform better on academic tests than the neighborhood school, does that mean they're doing better than the district, or don't have the, you know, figured out some funding issue that the district has not? And, you know, I think looking closer at the demographics of students that are attending a lot of charter schools, and this is due in part to the lack of oversight in our state law that Dan mentioned. You know, some charters serve easier to serve students, and so are not running up against some of the same expenses about harder to reach students that are districts, who of course have the obligation to and strive to serve every student that comes, you know, that lives in the area that they do.
So Susan Siegel had a question about the connection between school fund, or between education and other outcomes, literacy rates, dropout rates, graduation rates, and things that are sort of the cycle of poverty, crime, and prison. And do you expect to have any of that evidence in the case? Christina, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, we do have some expert testimony that we'll be offering that, looks at the economic impact of Pennsylvania's failure to fund our schools and, traces through the lack of graduation and the lack of college graduation and higher paying jobs. And so therefore, what that impact, that gap, really, what the economic growth that we are missing in our Pennsylvania economy because we are not educating our students in order for them to be successful in college and career.
And a lot of those facts, we'll also have facts where where that basic premise, that the connection between lack of education and incarceration has been discussed by government officials in the last number of years, including by some of the respondents in this case. And we will be sure to be you can be sure that we will be highlighting some of those issues when this case goes to trial. Howard Levinson asked, are you asking only for prospective relief and no relief for injuries in the past? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of practical reasons for that, but yes, we are not. What the basic premise of this case is that a school district has a responsibility to take a child in whatever state they arrive at that school and get them out the back door at 12th grade, ready for a college and for a meaningful family sustaining career, and have sort of the basic citizenship skills that we all need in a democracy. And so, for kids that have been like in underfunded schools, let's say for the last 6 years, practically speaking, or 8 years or 10 years or whatever, those kids might need sort of more intensive resources. But we're not asking for sort of damages in the past. We're saying, take your student body or take the Commonwealth student body, give them the resources that they need to be much more successful than they are today. So I saw Timmy Miller had a question about college attendance. Do you want to unmute and ask that question?
Yeah. First off, thanks y'all for the presentation. This was really informative. So I come from I graduated from Gailton Area School District, very small one in Pennsylvania, also underfunded. And some of the questions I had too in regards to student success were, have you also examined any metrics around students who maybe go on to trade school rather than college, or like post-high school graduation employment, and seen like what those success rates, and did you see a disparity if you have looked at them between schools that are more funded? Obviously, more funding tends more towards college. Have you seen any disparities in those other metrics though as well?
Christina, do you want to start or do you want me to answer? So the answer is yes, to the extent that the state actually tracks them. So there are certain things that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania purposefully does not track. We have essentially a workaround to track college success because there's actually a bar in state law, I think, that says essentially that Pennsylvania colleges are not allowed to communicate with Pennsylvania public schools in a way that would allow the Department of Education to be tracking success rates. And there's similar problems with job data too. So there's some data that does not exist purposefully, or at least negligently. We do have other metrics, though, including, so besides standardized test results, academic standardized test results, PSSAs and Keystones, there are test results that kids that are in CTCs take, the NOCTI if you're doing a trade program, you take that to try to become certified. We have licensure rates from graduates and things like that. So we very much are trying to make sure that we identify that thread. There are obviously a number of different paths that people can take, and we want to make sure that we highlight them all.
Thank you.
Sure. Let's see. I have time for one more question. Well, let me just say, for Bill Ewing, who asked what the size of the state budget is. So first, in terms of considering the billions of dollars at play here, education actually costs the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania itself spends more than $4 billion or $6 billion, which is to basic education. There's other things that the Commonwealth funds sort of in the education space, transportation, for example, special education. It pays for part of pension reimbursements. It's the biggest thing that we spend money on in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I don't know what the total budget is. I used to know that, but it's certainly our biggest ticket item.
Bigger
There
than
is
welfare?
not
37, Dan. The proposal this year is 37 billion.
$37 billion. Okay. And so we actually do have to raise funds. Now, what we always say to people is, that has to come from somewhere. And so practically speaking, if we want kids to have the resources that they need, that means raising revenue from somewhere, right? And whether that's a personal income tax like the governor proposed or something else, money does have to come from somewhere. There is not $4 billion sitting in a state treasury that we can just go get. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. We're in this sort of perpetual budget crisis because we don't raise funds. So
I think that ties also, somebody mentioned in the comments reference to New York State in another funding case, and New York State still not, claiming that they don't have the funds to be able to be compliant. And, I think as Dan's mentioning, like that's expected. And I think to bring it back to where you all can be helpful, I think, is to really keep the pressure on our state legislators, our state leaders, to show that this is important to us and we need a fix. So really appreciate you sharing and keeping this in the public conversation. Talk with your friends, talk with your neighbors, share if we can be helpful in bringing this information and presentation to other groups or community organizations that you're a part of. We're really going to need everybody involved to keep the pressure on the legislature, even after we get an order from the court.
Yep. And if you're here and you're on this list, you will be updated. The next thing that we expect to hear, as Christina said, is a trial date, more or less. And we've been waiting for a long time for a trial date in this case. This case was filed in 2014, and for a number of reasons. The case went up, had to be appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and came back down, and litigation is slow. We have a once in a generation or once in a century pandemic, which keeps things slow, which keeps us from being in the same room. But we do expect to go to trial this year. And you can be sure that the day we hear, we will let everyone know that, the time has come finally for Pennsylvania kids to have their day in court. So with that, I think for those questions that were not answered, some of whom I see from people that I know, I'm happy if you want to reach out to me directly, or if you want to email us, and we're happy to answer questions offline. And thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us today.
Thank you. Please check out the Fund Our Schools PA website.
See you, everybody.